Welcome to the New Frontiers in Global Research seminars and discussions at the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. Today, we're going to hear from two very distinguished experts in a seminar on how education, science, and technology can help reshape the global development goals and the sustainable development goals that we all are familiar with. I'm fortunate to have joining, actually, before I do that, I'm V.S. Subrahmanian, Professor of Computer Science and a faculty fellow in the Buffett Institute. It's my pleasure today to introduce two very distinguished panelists. First, Romain Murenzi. Romain, I've known him for many years, received his PhD in Belgium in physics. He went on to become a professor in the US, continued as the Minister of Education and Minister of Science and Technology for Rwanda in the post-genocide period. And during that time, he made very substantive contributions to raising the quality of education in Rwanda, as well as the quality of science and technology, so that Rwanda is now a fantastic example of a country which is moving along very well in its progress, especially since the horrible events of 1994. Since that period as minister, Romain continued and spent a few years in Washington, D.C., working at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, as well as the University of Maryland. And after that, he became the executive director of the World Academy of Science in Trieste, Italy. He took a few years off from that to serve as the director of, I should look at this carefully, of science policy and capacity building at UNESCO in Paris, and then went back to the executive directorship of TWAS in Trieste. Welcome, Romain.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The second speaker we have today is Jean-Louis Sarbib. Jean-Louis has been working in the development field for over 40 years at this time. He's also been a professor at the University of North Carolina and the University of Pennsylvania, and for several decades worked at the World Bank, serving as the VP for Africa, the VP for Middle East and North Africa, and as the Senior Vice President for Human Development in the bank. He is really one of the pioneers of the work and development that we see today at various multilateral organizations, starting from the World Bank. He serves on many boards, including academic boards, such as the Board of Trustees. He serves or has served as a trustee of the Ben Gurion University in Israel, the Partnership for Transparency, chairs of various boards associated with the G20 Compact with Africa, on the board of Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines, and as chair of the board of the UNESCO Institute of Statistics. He worked over the last 10 years or so as CEO of the Development Gateway, a nonprofit serving the goals of development across the world in Washington, D.C. So Jean-Louis, welcome to this session here. Thank you all for coming. And before I start shooting questions at our distinguished panelists, I'd like to thank Roberta Buffett Elliott, whose contribution and support to the Buffett Institute are central to the kinds of multidisciplinary partnerships that we're trying to build here at Buffett. So thank you, Roberta. So Jean-Louis, I'm sending my first question your way. As I said earlier, you've been involved in global development efforts for 40+ years. And during this time, you've seen a lot. So if you think back to where you were when you started in global development over 44 decades ago, how far do you think we've come? What is the journey that the world has seen, that multilateral bodies such as the World Bank and the UN have seen over the last 40 years? Where are we today compared to where you thought we would be today?
Thank you, V.S., and thank you for having me here. It's very exciting to be able to talk about these things. I joined the World Bank in 1980, and I left the World Bank in 2006. So over these almost 3 decades, a lot of things have changed. Now, the biggest plus you can give for development is the global increase in life expectancy. That is something that I think we could all be very proud of, even though it has not had the same positive impact everywhere around the world. Over this 20-some years, 2 or 3 things have changed. First of all, at the beginning, the World Bank had a monopoly in financing for development and a monopoly in knowledge, so that it was almost an obligatory passage to have to deal with the Bretton Woods institutions that, as you know, were set up to, at the end of the Second World War, to make sure that the world would not fall back into the kind of turmoil that led to the Second World War. Then, little by little, you could see the introduction of much more private investment in the world. In the beginning, in the middle of the 1990s, actually, the money coming from the private sector was beginning, in terms of direct foreign investment in countries, was beginning to dwarf the contribution of the official public development institutions. And since 2015, with the Sustainable Development Goals and the immense challenge of financing, then the world of development has begun to talk of moving from billions to trillions. And there is an incredible amount of savings in the world. So the idea for people in development is now, how do you lower the risk of the private sector so that this enormous amount of money can come in to fill the gaps in infrastructure, the gaps in health, the gaps in a number of situations that reduce the ability of the developing world to make progress. So the change has been one of going from very few actors in development to many more actors in development, including large foundations. The Gates Foundation today puts between $4 and $5 billion into development on a yearly basis. And that has made it much more difficult for the receiving countries to be able to retain control, because they have to please and talk to a lot of people. So that really puts a very, very big premium on the quality of human resources, on the quality and the capabilities of these countries, A, to know where they want to go, and B, to herd the cats that are their external partners, so they can actually be the ones who decide what their future is. So that's been a very big change, in the sense that there is much more now in the field of development, and many more actors, many different sources of funding. And to give you just an example, the amount of money that official development assistance coming into the developing world is less than the remittances of workers sending money to their countries of origin that work abroad. And the largest source of funding for development now is private investment, provided, again, that it can be liberated. I insist on the quality of human resources, because after all these years of working in development, I was fond to say that if somebody was to put a gun in my head and said, you can only make one kind of investment, what would it be? My answer is education. Because increasingly, with the fact that knowledge today is just as important as financial resources, the ability to use, to leverage knowledge is absolutely essential. And that is one of the big transformation. And I said in the beginning that the World Bank used to be a monopolist in finance and a monopolist in knowledge. Today, these two monopolies are gone. There's many more sources of finance and there's many more sources of knowledge. Again, importance of human resources and education. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. So I wanted to sort of pick up on two things that you said. You emphasized the importance of education and the importance of financing. And I'd like to sort of take them one by one. So coming to education, Romain, you've been Minister of Education. You took over as Minister of Education in Rwanda under very, very difficult circumstances, a terrible genocide, which led to the killing of over 800,000 people. And in a few years, I remember looking at the stats from the World Bank and the UNDP and others for Rwanda several years ago. In a matter of about 10 years, you'd brought up the enrollment rates at the pre-primary level in Rwanda up to something on the order of 96%, if I remember right. And so, how did you do that? That's an incredible accomplishment. It dwarfs the enrollment rates at that pre-primary level of kids in many other countries in the developing world, which had not gone through the kind of horrible events that occurred in Rwanda. So could you say a little bit about how you did that, what challenges you faced, and perhaps also, what lessons you learned and how one might be able to do this better?
Thank you very much, VS. Thank you also for this invitation. In 2001, I was a full professor of physics and the chair of physics department at Clark Atlanta University in Georgia. 7 years earlier, Rwanda experienced the genocide against the Tutsi, where 1 million people died in that conflict. Although many things have been done in terms of starting schools, opening schools, in the previous 7 years, there were a lot of things to do. And I could see that, and I'll come back to that. But talking also about history, 2001 is the beginning of the previous development agenda. Almost now, every 15 years, there is a development agenda. So in 2015, there was the development agenda called the Millennium Development Goals. And among those goals, one of them was access to education, primary education in particular. And you have other goals there, such as the HIV and health, and you have that, you could check. And then now you have the other development goals, which is the sustainable development goals. I would like to link with that. So when I arrived in 2001, there was several challenges. I could say physical challenges, and what I could say also non-physical challenges. But the physical challenges are the teachers. It's a physical. A teacher has to be in the classroom. So what happened in 1994, many teachers were involved in the killings. This means some of the teachers actually fled the country. Some of them were in prison. So this means that there was a vacuum in terms of teachers. So it takes time to train a good teacher. So it's a big challenge. Textbooks. If we talk about 1 million, let's say even 1 million children in primary school, if you give one book of math, one book of language, one book of geography, and then another book of general social sciences, talking about 4 to 5 books, and if each book costs $20, $50, we are talking about $200. $200 times a million is 200 million. This is more away at the time, more than the GDP of Rwanda at the time. Because at the time, Rwanda's GDP was less than $1 per day. So we are talking about a big challenge in education. But most of the books also were printed in Europe. If a book is printed somewhere in Belgium or the UK, It will take time before the book arrives. Be printed, sent to Mombasa, Mombasa through trucks, and it arrives in Kigali and distributing the books in the mountains and valleys of Rwanda. You understand the books may not even reach the kids. Even when the books reach the kids, some teachers decide to put them on the shelf so that when the inspector comes, they see the books are clean. So this is a reality. So the other challenge was the infrastructure. Most of the schools that were built before the genocide were mud, with mud bricks. This means this will be able to fall. There were accidents in that. So many challenges in that. So what do you do? And then you have the other, what I could say, non-physical, the division, ethnicity. They would bring the two ethnic group against each other. But also access to education was linked to ethnicity, was linked to region. Going from primary education to secondary education, there was quota. Going from secondary to higher to secondary to college, the same. So how do you make changes in that circumstance as you build your country? So when we arrive there, you have to do policy. What does the policy can you do? Access to education, access and equity is very central. And then you have the quality of education, very important. So we put up the policies and went through parliament to have the right laws to make sure that access to education is a human right. Not only you need to put people in school, but you need to make that the schools are safe enough so that the parents feel like sending the kids to school is somewhere that is safe, not only the infrastructure, but also the division is what was done earlier. So education in Rwanda became, after 2001 and beyond, a place where you can send your kid and you feel safe. At the same time, you send a kid in that, it's part of the global development agenda, the Millennium Development Goal, the education for all goals. No, you send the kid now there because the kids of Rwanda, they need to grow to be leaders in the region. So you want not only Rwanda to do that, but you want also those countries in the region to also try to fulfill these goals that are very, very important. So coming back to that was a very, very challenge. But also for that, you need to have the funding. We have to work with the World Bank, what we'll call multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank, the African Development Bank, but also work with the bilateral, such as the Department for International Development, the UK, such as USAID, such as other, like Swedish International Development Agencies. All these organizations gave some support to Rwanda in order to be able to achieve one of the goals of the Millennium Development Goals, at the same time, so what we call the education for all goals. So, and that became very, very important. And if you look back now in Rwanda, after 20 years, the other day, one of the kids, a young girl, she's doing a PhD in condensed physics matter. She was a student in primary school in 2002, 2003. She's now 24. She's doing a PhD, master's, and was a PhD. And when she came to me, she said, you were a minister at the time when I was in primary school. And you can see that projection to see Rwanda is not only doing agriculture, which is very important, but also moving towards areas such as condensed physics matter, things related to artificial intelligence, ICT, and so forth. So Rwanda has become a model for education and science in the region. And that changed completely the way you look at a country that was torn in the past and moving forward. So knowledge becomes a center of development. Education, as he said, becomes the center of development.
You know, Romain, that reminds me of something that I'd meant to ask you about earlier, which is Rwanda it's a small country, lots of agricultural products coming out, such as high quality coffee, some of which I've been, fortunate enough to consume both there and here. And, and the knowledge economy is a big part of the future economic development of Rwanda. And to make this happen, Rwanda has done some really interesting things, such as partner with Carnegie Mellon University to build a campus there. Could you say a little bit about how that kind of operation worked?
So in 2000, after we finished the educational policy, primary education, secondary education, higher education, financing of higher education, put a loan system to make sure that higher education is sustainable, we moved towards the science policy called National Innovation Science Technology Policy that was actually implemented in 2006. Through that policy, I felt that not only Rwanda can build its own science, but it needs to look outside. So we worked with Carnegie Mellon and some other institutions to see how they could come in Rwanda and actually make the change. Because what you want is to have students from the region bring this knowledge. Not only Carnegie Mellon, we want them, but we want to attract the talent from the region. Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, Tanzania. These students will come there with that kind of level. But it's not only Carnegie Mellon, we have also the African Institute of Mathematical Sciences. We have the International Center for Theoretical Physics in Trieste, just put a physics institute there, and some other institutions. We thought that you need to bring the talent to breed your own citizen with the outside world. That was very, very important. And during that period also as a minister, I thought it was very important to bring the leadership of the country outside. And I'm proud to say that at that time, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, invited President Kagame, came and spoke at the opening of the annual meeting of 2008. Very interestingly, at that meeting, he met with Susan Hochfeld, who invited him to speak at MIT. That led to MIT wanting to work with Rwanda in establishing a Center for Climate Change. So you can see things coming from there, and also the President Kagame at the time also spoke at the Royal Society, saying that, if in Africa we don't build science, we will be an appendage of history. So investment in science and knowledge is at the center of development. So that's something that is we think is very, very important, as we say. But also science is very important in the sense that it builds critical thinking. During the genocide, they will tell you, go and kill Ariel. You take the machete, you don't even ask, why should I go and kill him? Why should I come and kill the other one? You don't ask. So in terms of that, building critical thinking at the lowest level of education and going up is very, very important. So science and technology, not only for development, that is very true, but also building the mind of people. So we think that is a very, very important. And UNESCO think that and it built on actually peace is building the mind of people. So knowledge is at the center of this.
I love some of those sentences. Peace is built in the minds of people. Really, really insightful quotes. So one, you mentioned the importance of investment in education. Jean-Louis has mentioned it. So Jean-Louis, I'm going to go back to you. You worked in financing issues related to achievement of the SDGs for many, many years. And you've seen many efforts to fund projects, fund large institutional grants to governments and like Rwanda. Of these efforts that you've seen, which ones have worked? And in your analysis, why have they worked well? Which ones didn't work, and why did they not work? Could you say a few words about that? And I, actually, as an example, before I let you speak, I always think of South Korea. 50 years back, they were not. They were basically a developing economy. Today, they're a powerhouse economically, scientifically, and in business and commerce. That's the kind of transformation we'd like to see many, many countries achieve. So what makes that happen in some cases, not in others?
Well, if I could answer this question in 5 minutes, I can buy Twitter. But basically, I think it's a very difficult question. And over the years, I've asked myself, why is it that some countries succeed and others do not? And having worked in that field for a long time, my answer is that we know all the necessary conditions. We know that you need education. We know that you need a policy framework that prevents inflation, that do not push countries into the debt traps. We know that you need infrastructure. We know that you need a financial system that works and allows small and medium enterprises to work. We know that you need a justice system that enforces contracts and attracts the kind of investment, national and foreign, that I talked about. But even if you have all of this, you cannot say development will ensue in a way that will improve the lives of people. So there is, in all chemical reactions, you need a catalyst. You need something to happen that will make sure that all of these necessary conditions, when present, will lead to a result that makes a difference. And at the risk of sounding very pedestrian, I think that's the importance of leadership. And not only leadership, but a leadership that is clean, leadership that is accountable, and leadership that has a passion for transforming the lives of the people. And unfortunately, this is an exception rather than the rule in many of the countries where I've had the privilege and many often the frustrations of working. Now, you talked about South Korea. South Korea had leaders that did things that were very unorthodox. They chose various industries where they wanted to invest, but they did something which is very rare. They held the people that they helped, who were becoming very wealthy, they held them accountable for results. And so in too many countries, when you have, say, an enterprise that is owned by the government that is not doing well, the government will double down and continue to invest resources in that enterprise, very often because of networks of influence, because of the political economy, et cetera, et cetera. What the South Koreans did was that they said, okay, we're going to help you with steel, we're going to help you with the car industry, but you have to meet a certain results. If you meet them, we'll continue. If you don't meet them, you're out and we stop. So that this demand for results in South Korea was a very, very big explanations for this. Now, the other example that we can reflect upon, and it goes back to what Romain was saying about the importance of knowledge, is the relationships between China and the World Bank. It is very clear that at the beginning, China was using the World Bank to learn how to do projects, to learn how to manage, to learn how to go from something at a small scale to the large scale that is China. And they continue to this day as China moves up the value chain, if you will, from assembly industry to more and more advanced technologies. And it's a very controversial subject. They continue to borrow money from the World Bank, not because they need the money. You know, China has reserves that are a multiple of what they need, and probably the largest foreign currency reserves in the world, but they want more knowledge. So that as we talked about the evolution of the development field before. I think what's happening is that money is important, but knowledge is equally important. And the issue of, I mean, to go to Rwanda, I think there's a very clear example of what leadership can do. Romain explained, you don't see very many heads of state go to talk to scientific societies because given what Rwanda is, given where it is, given its size, the decision was made that the knowledge economy is how Rwanda can become much bigger than its natural endowment, if you will, permit. And so Rwanda is now becoming a knowledge center in the sub-region that serves much larger countries. There's a vision, there is leadership, and I know that President Kagame's leadership is somewhat controversial, but it emphasizes the importance of leadership to make sure that once you have all of these necessary conditions, then something happens with a very big word that I don't think is high enough in the lexicon of development, which is accountability. Let me stop here.
So accountability, what kinds of, you mentioned the example of South Korea, Jean-Louis, where, the leaders of South Korea held the people responsible for implementing many of their programs accountable for results. But sometimes circumstances can make that difficult. There can be natural disasters, calamities like the pandemic that we've been experiencing and still are struggling with. So how do you feel, what is the role of institutions in managing that accountability and sort of assessing the risk involved in certain large efforts and setting the goals? How do institutions do that? How did the World Bank do that? How do similar multilateral development banks and organizations do that?
Well, the people that need to be the holders of accountability are the citizens of the country. No external organization as powerful as the World Bank or the IMF or the African Development Bank are can play the role that an informed citizenry who feels empowered to act can do. So that brings me to the fact that people thought that data and the availability of information broadly shared with the citizenry would be something that would help increase the accountability. And that's why, again, the very big transformation, it used to be that the World Bank owned its data, and if you wanted to use it, you had to buy it. So there was a big revolution, which is the open data revolution, which, you are very big, you know more about this than I do, but the idea was that if you make information available to citizens, if the budgets are transparent, if the people who know what should come to their community, know what should come to their community, have that information, then the chain of accountability can begin to be stronger. And I am very fond of a study that was done in the World Bank, again, on education spending in Uganda, not to cite the country. Before people that were responsible for local school districts knew what was supposed to come to their district, 20% of the money leaving Kampala arrived in the district. There was a lot of sort of leakage, shall we say, on the line. Once the community knew how much they were getting and could hold the local people accountable, then 80% of the resources allocated in Kampala came to the local districts. So that is an example, but I think we have in some way been somewhat naive about the fact that, give them the information, they will use it and accountability will rise. And the work, VS, that you and I did together at Development Gateway showed us that there is no automaticity between the availability of information and the rise in accountability. Because data, like everything else, is not neutral to power. So that what you really need to do is, first of all, answer two questions: data for what and data for whom. And too often, and I saw this when I was at the bank, when I was at the statistics at UNESCO, too often the information that is being collected is collected not for the benefit of the people who can use it at the coal face, so to say, but for the benefit of the people who fund the activity. So that very often it was very clear during the work that I did on HIV that you really needed to get a lot of information up to the people who were funding the HIV and AIDS fight, but the people on the ground needed their own information to follow their patients, to make sure that they were taking their medicine as they were needed, and that information was not funded. So when you had people who really knew and were committed to what they were doing, they had to invent a parallel system, because the system that was funded for the up, and it was not funded for people locally. So I think the data revolution is extremely important, but is also revealed that data are not immune to power relations. At the Development Gateway, they developed a methodology to make sure that we understood what the data was for, what the data was for whom, and we design technological system around that, because very often you want to mobilize data. What happens? You get to the technology right away. And the technology should not be first, the technology should be last. Once you've understood exactly what the needs are, what the power relation is, who's going to use the data for doing what, then you can build a system that's fit for purpose. But if you say, and usually what we have seen, and we made that mistake, we used to build data systems. The president or the minister of finance or the prime minister will come and big things on television, in a newspaper, and for about a week or 10 days, you can see a spike in the use of data and in the visits to the data side, and you look 3 months later and the thing is dead, because it was not really designed with the users. It was not designed fit for purpose. So that, so this accountability, even when you give people the capability of having that information, it's another necessary condition. And now it leads me to something. I know she's going to tell me I have less than 1 minute left. It's going to lead me to a very big issue that unfortunately I won't have time to do, is the big questions to which I don't have an answer, which is democracy a plus and essential for development or not? I don't have the answer to that, because the biggest success in fighting poverty, which is SDG goal number 1, is in China, at 800 million people that have been taken out of poverty. When you go and you make a big speech about the importance of democracy for development, which I believe very strongly into, and you have China, you have to ask yourself questions. I don't have the answers for you.
Well, China certainly made very, very impressive strides in achieving the SDGs. But let me pivot for a minute and come back to children and education, Romain, and to current affairs. So we're seeing a terrible crisis in the Ukraine, or I'm sorry, in Ukraine. I was corrected several times by Ukrainians to say Ukraine, not the Ukraine. So we're seeing a terrible crisis in Ukraine. We're seeing children who have witnessed horrific events. We're seeing children whose schooling has been severely compromised. Based on your experience in Rwanda, which was a post-conflict experience, what can we do now while the conflict is still raging to help these Ukrainian kids start returning to normalcy, start getting the kind of education that they deserve? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Thank you. Yes, it's quite challenging because the situation is still ongoing. If we were done with the war, then sometimes it can be much easier to be able to respond. But what happened in Rwanda just right after the genocide, UNICEF will show that many children have experienced trauma. They saw a family member being killed. They lost people, so they saw that. And if you think about the future, it is important to start to teach peace education. So the ministry thought peace education was very important. From the beginning, early, to teach these kids, revenge is not good. So peace education became very central to the educational system. And I did mention the issue of critical thinking is very important. As part of critical thinking, people make choices, and that's very, very important, because in Rwanda, that didn't happen because of that critical thinking component. So at the beginning, early on, peace education became very, very central. But now let's come back to the children who are in refugee now, who left the country or in camp somewhere, but not only in that particular country that you just mentioned, but in some other places in the world, you have children who are in refugee camps, but sometimes these children will be adult and maybe return back to their country. So in the refugee camp, I think you may be able to think as an institute, how do you support these children to continue to be educated? Critical thinking, peace education, at some point they return back home. A friend of mine, ours, Vaughan Turekian, from the National Academy of Sciences, the US, has been mentioning an initiative actually to teach science in refugee camps, because that will have an impact in the future of critical thinking when these kids some point return back to their country. But sometimes they don't return back to their country, but they stay in the neighboring country. So coming back to Ukraine, I think wherever the children are, wherever the countries have received these children as refugees and families, they should be able to continue to give them access to education. The reason why Rwanda things happened also was that in the neighboring countries, although higher education was most costly, very expensive, actually primary education and secondary was free during the time when I was a refugee. So I went to school with the other kids. The Burundian kids went to school together. And secondary school was completely free. I went even in a boarding school for free. So that was very important. This means I had access to education. So was Murigande, so was the people that you know from Rwanda. Those who later on, after the war, after the genocide of the Tutsi, against the Tutsi, they came back and do the rebuilding of the country. So wherever they are, these children in refugee camps or countries that have received these children should be able to continue to give them education. At the same time, if there is a possibility for peace education would be very important. Not to be very negative against the opponent of their country, it could be very, very important. So once the war ends, they return back, they will be able to to be safe in their brain, because the safety of the brain is so important in this time. So peace education is very, very central. And the UNICEF, United Nations for Children Fund, and UNESCO have a bigger role to play in this.
And
Please go ahead, Jean-Louis.
if I can, you mentioned the horrible situations of the kids in Ukraine, but I also want to talk about a less visible crisis, which is the results of the pandemic on the kids in Africa. Because there's been anywhere between the number of kids who have lost at least a year of education if they were in school is in the tens of millions. And it's going to be very difficult to get these children back to school. And because of what Romain and I have been saying about the importance of education for development, you can see that in addition to Africa having had its first recession because of the pandemic, then the long tail of the pandemic is the impact on all these kids who are missing school, and many of them will not get back to school. So that, you know, this is a silent crisis, which is absolutely dramatic, but that nobody talks about because it is not visible. And I think that, you know, to go back to the education goals and the SDGs, since we talk about this, there's been a tremendous success of the SDGs in the enrollment in primary education. That what they have done, though, is that they've made it possible for kids who had to pay for school or pay for uniforms to not have to pay for school or pay for uniforms. So you've had an enrollment which has gone up, but quality of education has gone down. And I was recently working on a strategy for education in West Africa, and the World Bank has something that they call learning poverty, which is something that was developed together with UNESCO, which measures the number of kids who cannot read and have numeracy at the end of primary school. And in West Africa, the number of kids who are in learning poverty is above 60%. So that, you know, this really, to me, is, and Africa is a continent to which I've devoted the better part of my life. I just don't understand how this is going to work. And that is, you know, so that, yes, Ukraine is horrible. Ukraine is in the headlines. Africa is not in the headlines, and Africa needs to get all the attention that is possible. And it's not simply money. It's, you know, what Romain was saying earlier. You need teachers who are trained. And so that, because the education system in Africa has been so behind, you don't have teachers who are trained. And to have teachers who are trained, who stay and train, you need to pay them. To pay them, you need to have resources. And we know how difficult it is for African countries to mobilize resources. So that the crisis in education, and back to the key thing, I really do not understand how especially, and you see the results. You know, the Sahelian countries, the countries that Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, the countries that are really at the southern end of the Sahara, is it a mystery why they have so much turmoil and terrorism? It's not. You live better with a Kalashnikov than you need with an education that has taught you nothing. So that really is, you know, that keeps me up at night.
So that's a devastating indictment of the, funding strategies of many countries in terms of financing education, especially in the Sahel. So, let me, I see we're coming up almost to 1 o'clock, and I do want to throw open the floor to questions. So let me ask Romain one last question before we invite comments from the audience. So Romain, you've had a very interesting life, from being a refugee to being a professor to being, a minister to being, the head of various UN-related organizations. So could you tell us a little bit about your journey? If there are students here who want to, become professionals in international development, but who don't know where to start, or who have some ideas of where to start, but want to know how to focus, how to maneuver through the path. Could you tell us a little bit about your story and give them some advice at the same time on how to do that? So.
It's very difficult. Of course, always be true to yourself, and that's very important. But also not to give up your dream. If you have a dream, you need to sometimes stick to it. It may happen. When I was a kid, actually graduating from the University of Burundi with a bachelor's degree in mathematics, as a refugee, I could not get a scholarship for a PhD. I could not also even being a teaching assistant. So I was left with going to teach in secondary school as a teacher, math teacher. So I had two dreams. One was to do science, physics and physics and geometry and PhD. That was my dream. And the second one, as a refugee growing with other kids, going back to your country, I want to work for my country. So I could see already the first dream of going to do a PhD was not going, of course, not in Burundi, because at that time it was not even possible. I could see other going to do PhD. I could see that dream was going away. But anyway, I became a teacher at the age of 23 in mathematics in the rural Burundi with an all-girls school at the time, 4 classrooms, nearly 40 children in every class. And they were very behind. But I worked very hard. Even Saturday and Sunday, during the report from the nuns, they say, he even teaches on Sundays in the report. So after that year, actually, I caught the attention of Bujumbura, the capital. They brought me back in Bujumbura. At the time, the teachers of mathematics in the senior class, they were mostly Europeans. So in one of the two best schools in Bujumbura, the two teachers left. So they have to find a teacher, an African. So finally, they went and dipped me from Gitega, that capital. I came back to Bujumbura. I went from 4 classrooms to 2 classrooms, from 40 students to less than 20 per class. And you understand that it was very easy for that. Of course, I challenged it. That year, my kids were the best in the whole Burundi. So that year, I was the celebrated teachers. I go in the street, they say, they recognize Romain in my neighborhood. It's there. But anyway, but in the meantime, I've been trying to get a scholarship, writing and things like that. But you're right to get a scholarship from rural Burundi. It gets to the capital, then you have to go to Europe, and to come back to take probably a month, maybe 2 months, before you get even the response. Actually, at some point, I got closer to get the scholarship. But in the guys who were deciding, they say, oh, this guy is a very good teacher. He's a refugee. If we give him the scholarship, he will stay in Europe. In Burundi, we lose a good teacher. They didn't give me the scholarship. So apparently somebody in the group was not happy. So he took my dossier and sent it to the university. So the chairman of the physics department, actually, who became my supervisor, wrote to me and sent me a package of physics and geometry. And at the same time, he gave me a form to fill. So a year later, I got a letter in my pigeonhole You didn't get so many letters at the time, just probably one, you get one once a month, and it was the one. So then I went 3 years later, so after my bachelor's degree, to do a PhD in Europe. Europe, at the time, don't forget, I arrived there. I'm a refugee with a refugee passport. You cannot even, my supervisor had to call the Minister of Foreign Affairs for me to go to France. But very interestingly, the pioneer of the wavelet transform, the theory that I was working on, he's a Jewish from Croatia, from Zagreb. He told me, he was the father of the wavelet, Grossman, told me, I was a refugee. I'm going to help you. And he put me on the list of the French. So I was traveling in Europe like the other French. So in the mobility, Europe mobility is very, very important. If you, as a student, you get a chance to have a mobility, to go spend, if you are a PhD student, even just to give an abstract somewhere. So I was able to go actually to many countries in Europe, including the UK, as a student. So mobility becomes very, very important. This means that once I finished my PhD, I got a job in Paris to teach for 6 months as a teaching assistant in Paris. And later on, I went to the south of France for a postdoc. And during that time, I realized that as a student, I think relationship is very important. So having a good relation with your teacher, even if with your the community you are working with, is very, very important. So this means that during that period, I developed a good relationship with the student and the faculty in France and things like that. That's why I did the job there. But most importantly, in 1991, there was a discussion on wavelet and turbulence for the weather and things like that. That's the theory between French and the US. My group, they put me in the French group as a French citizen, and I flew to Rutgers University. Once I was in that room, things changed dramatically, because in that room, the person who gave the talk, Ingrid Obeshi, they call her in New York Times the mother, the grandmother of digital analysis of images and things like that. She came and greet me. And some people were in the room who were looking for somebody to hire. They asked, this African guy that what is he? They say, oh, by the way, he's looking for a job. So I ended up in Atlanta, Georgia. My first dream of doing physics was done, but my second dream of going to Rwanda was away, because Rwanda has started a war in 1990. So I called this priest that was my friend. I said, I'm going to the US. He told me, don't worry, the world is around. One day you return back to your country. So here I go to Atlanta, become even a US citizen by 2000. And by 2001, I have given away to return back to Rwanda to serve. I received this call saying that, Murenzi, the president of Rwanda is looking for a minister, and your name came about. Are you interested in helping? Because I know many people died during the genocide. I lost many people from my families and things like that. I thought, why not? So I decided to return back to Rwanda to help. So my second dream was actually achieved during my lifetime. So don't give up. But the most important thing is really to stick to the basic, to your dream, to what you want to do. At the same time, try to make a difference in your community. I was discussing with Ariel earlier today how growing up in the capital of Bujumbura, in the cities, I didn't like bullies. So this means that I was actually in between guys who were fighting. One day I was even almost killed because the guy was so strong, but I would go even, they were strong, I'm a short guy, I just go between them. So each time there was a fight, they would say, Murenzi, they didn't know Romain because they pronounce it completely. They call me Murenzi. So Murenzi, they're fighting. So I rush, I between them. They call me the UN. And I didn't know that one day I will work for the United Nations for education and peace. Thank you.
All right. So on that note, I think, we should throw the floor open for questions, both to folks on Zoom. Please send your questions in if you've not done so already, and I'll try to read them out and answer them, as well as to folks in the room.
Maybe we can start with the question online I have here from Larry Birnbaum, professor of computer science here at Northwestern. He asks, we know a bit more about both the positives and negatives of online education. How much of an impact has this had or could it have on education? What kinds of investments are being made or should be made in making this work better in Rwanda or other developing nations or places under severe stress? So, online education, positives and negatives.
Jean-Louis has alluded to it on the issue related to the lost years of education in Africa. During the previous development agenda, I'll just bring back to the Millennium Development Goals between 2000 and 2015. I was Minister of Education. I could realize that I wanted actually science, technology, and computers in school. And people would thought that computer and connectivity was not important. They thought textbooks and the building and the classroom were important. That part was very, very bad, because those countries that didn't invest in that, now they have challenges. During that period also, we know that I advocated for a broadband connectivity. We built a broadband infrastructure. I even went to Mombasa and Dar es Salaam to see if they landed there so that we can build the cable. The president told me, Romain, you are just here, you are building the fiber optic here. You have not even go to Mombasa and check if the fiber is there, so we can link with them. So he sent me a mission to go and see if the fiber is there. Because they were talking, this submarine cable around Africa. I went there and I saw, Your Excellency, the fiber is there. So we did link with the ministry, the Minister of ICT of Uganda and of Tanzania and Kenya for the agreement, because they could take the fiber optic to anywhere because they have other borders, but to have Rwanda as the priority for that. And I'm glad that they did it even before I left Rwanda in 2009, because that was my last mission. So coming back to that, what happened in Africa and in the developing world in general during the COVID, it is lost year because they didn't have that infrastructure. So this is part number one. So ICT is very important for education. ICT is very important also because we're talking about critical thinking. You see, educational system is so behind that programming is not taught in primary school, because we are still very, very behind. Even just solving problems, we are not able. So we should be able to come back and reflect on actually the teaching of programming at the basic level in that. And we have entered in the era of fourth industrial revolution. So ICT will have a very important. But what I could say also that probably Jean-Louis linked it on the issue of data. Data is so central. The children, because of the online education, will have more and more access to education, will be able to use more and more data. They will be actually, people will be able to collect data on them. So the issue of privacy is going to be a big, big issue, in particular in the developing world, where you don't have regulation. Data is not regulated. There is no data policy. There is no, so that's something that's going to be very, very important. So educational land is going to be very important. It can also be harmful to the children. Harmful material is going to be there. That's why what we are doing in cybersecurity is very important. The issue, how do you prevent that? How do you put the right walls, the right to discriminate the good and bad material? These are things that are very, very important. So online education is going to be there to stay after the COVID. The challenge is how do you implement it well? So access to the broadband connectivities in poor countries, access to the computer, access to the material, the right material on the computer, but also preventing the harmful material from reaching the computer of the kid while she or he is learning.
Thanks, Romain. Jean-Louis, did you want to add something to that?
Just to emphasize what Romain said about the infrastructure, but you also have to remember that before you get to connectivity, you have to get to electricity. And in Africa, it's still a very big issue. And then you have to have a cultural revolution in pedagogical talent, because again, technology is not the answer. It's if you don't have the software of the teachers being taught, that you don't teach online the way you teach with in the class, then you have not gone further. But there's been some real innovative experiences using whatever technology is there, in particular using texting as a way to reach a lot of kids. So you don't, because computers are not, in the kids who need it the most are the ones who don't have electricity and don't have computers. But the penetration of mobile telephones, even not smartphones, is enough to begin to give some material. But the big, in my view, once we have the infrastructure, the transformation of the culture of teaching, and very often the more resistance to changing the culture of teachings are the teachers. So how do you really transform this and really create a, so it's back to what I was saying. Technology is a part of the solution, provided that you have the whole system that has been prepared to make the optimal use of that technology. And I'm talking again about the countries that are behind. I think it's very different even in the United States, where you don't have some of these problems. You really, the need to teach, to train teachers to teach differently is very, very important.
If you allow me to
No, please.
that's a very important point. The teacher is a very important point. In 2009, when I advocated for one laptop per child, because I thought earlier the issue of textbooks. So I thought physically textbook will have always a challenge in our country, even we at another time. So I thought having a computer like the one that we had from Media Lab from MIT was important. So basically we worked with MIT, Media Lab on that. So we have I can say a trial in the countryside. So with the team from MIT came, and at the time we didn't have the broadband as we have it now. So we use a satellite. So one of the company gave it connectivity to a satellite to that particular school called Rwanda. So they gave to each child a computer and the teachers. Of course, the kids, definitely, because this computer, they have also possibility for camera. And so someone, when they went and filmed the birth of a calf, someone then checked their best player. They have never seen, probably some have never even seen a color picture. So they will go see their best. Some won't even, Google the Minister of Education. They have never seen the Minister of Education. They don't see the Minister of Education every day. So then when I visited, so they visited, the kids showed, and then there was a speech. And the head teacher, one head teacher would have like 6 or 7 primary schools. So when they took their laptop to the shelf, and they were waiting for a training. So the teacher were waiting for a training, but the kids were already trained. So that showed us from there. Then of course we all on this policy on ICT in education. Make sure that actually, as you start, it is important that the teachers are being involved in that. So that was what you say is very important. Yeah.
Do we have more questions? Please.
Hi, so I'm Josiah Hester, assistant professor of computer engineering here.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of wanted to ask a little bit about accountability, which Jean-Louis, you had mentioned, and you'd said something that I thought was really fantastic about how, and I had to write it down to quote it, like data are not immune to power relations. And I think a lot of times, as a technologist, someone who builds and deploys things that, hopes it will help people, we sometimes maybe forget that. So I'm just wondering what maybe, both of your thoughts are on how technology, especially as it's advanced so dramatically with things like AI and incredible cybersecurity techniques, the Internet of Things, as it's had advanced and in some ways been centralized amongst large companies, is it, something that could be used for accountability that could aim or arm and enable citizenry versus these large entities to enable this accountability? Or do we need to have some other approaches to have technology enable accountability, right? At least with this new kind of wave. And I'll work on forming this question because I think we're having dinner together, and so I'll ask you again.
Well, if I have an answer, it's very different at different levels. I think when you think of a very circumscribed data problem, then you have more, sort of design, human-centered design, and all of these things. Just working with the person who's going to be using it just mitigates a bit this power relationship. Where I think we are really failing big time is the companies, the Googles and the Facebooks and the Twitter, God help us with this, that really are in fact making very good legal arguments that their business models requires networks, so that you cannot use the normal consumer protection arguments to break monopolies, because they say the consumers are better served when we have the largest possible network because we increase the value. By doing this, they are really becoming the arbiters of accountability without any legitimacy to do that. And I think that we have a real problem in society of what is the proper relation, what is the power relationship between the regulatory agencies and these enormous corporations that have enough power so that they in fact control the regulatory agencies. It's not unlike the Jay Gould era when he added the Western Union to his banking so that he had all the control of everything. So we are living again in an era of robber barons, but we don't have the regulatory capability for this, in large part because the nature of the beast, and you're a professor of computer science, so you know this better than I do, is very different. So that the power of data, and then if you add on it the opacity of algorithms on top of this, then you really you are in a world of, so what we see as the user interface is very different from what's behind it. And we've just got some glimpses of it in more recent days with the revelations of how the algorithms work, combined with the business model, which is based on advertising. So, that really paints a pictures where I think we're gonna have a true legal revolution in many ways to get accountability to the big ones. I think it's slightly less complicated at a lower level when you design systems that are fit for purpose. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's the best I can do.
Thank you, Jean-Louis. How about other questions? Do we have more online? Okay. So,
Can I
oh, please, yeah. So why don't we have, one final concluding remark from Romain, and then I'll wrap things up.
Okay. So I'd like first and then I can conclude, if you allow me, concluding remark. On this issue of data, the challenge for the developing world in general would be, do you have the infrastructure to store data, to store it? That's a big challenge. This means your data is going to be outsourced somewhere else. So number two, even if you have the data, the issue of transfer the data, I mean, the issue of connectivity is important. But analyzing the data, that also becomes very important. You need to have your own computer scientists, you need to have image analysts. So your data does not actually belong to you because you don't have the capacity. So science technology, the importance of having that is important. What kind of investment in science, what kind of investment in scientific infrastructure, including that one. So, and then the whole issue of legal issue. The data that they are using is mine, is yours, is turned into a business model. So in Europe, they have an omnibus data protection law, which is that you know. But in the US, it's more sectoral. We don't have that. So in the US, you are not really actually protected in that. So the privacy in the US, you can talk about it, but it's like it doesn't exist. The previous CEO of Sun Microsystem, the defunct company, used to say that, get over it, privacy doesn't exist anyway. So if you look at that, it's a really a big challenge. Yeah.
All right, so thank you very much. I'm going to wrap things up by thanking all of you in the audience, both physically present here at Buffett as well as present on Zoom, for coming to this session. If you've not grabbed a lunch bag, please go ahead and help yourself. I want to thank the folks on Zoom for attending. And I'd like to thank our two very distinguished panelists. Please join me in giving them a hand.